introduce our next guest. Mark Leeper is with us. He's the executive director of the Disability Action Center in Moscow, Idaho. And he and I go way back. We've known each other for a long time. And he's done some amazing work on behalf of people with disabilities. And so I'm so glad that he agreed to come and share with us his knowledge and his thoughts about shades of disability in the media, painful reminders and pleasurable trends. So give a warm welcome to Mark Leeper. You're so welcome.
The room set hits this without spilling it on both computers. Well, thank you and welcome. And I just came back from Acacia's presentation, and well done. And one more demonstration of this topic being so broad that we could spend literally a couple of days on it. And so I was asked to kind of put together a presentation and not really knowing what other folks were talking about. And so interestingly enough, some of what I'm going to talk about will dovetail nicely with what Acacia mentioned in hers. And that is some discussion of disability in news stories and what we tend to see. So what I want to talk about is, a question mark. I don't know how many shades of disability there are in the media. There could be 50, but that's been used. And so I didn't want to step on that. And actually, I have to take responsibility for having stolen this idea. I loved it when I was in an Americans with Disabilities Act symposium, and a person from the federal government came up, and the first slide was complete with the cross, the lines on it, and it was 50 shades of the ADA. And so I thought, well, that was great. Anybody to get up in front of a brand new audience, especially when you remember the former federal government, then you would do those things, and so it was great. So anyway, painful reminders of what's happened in the past, with some exceptions, and pleasurable trends. So let me see if I can figure out how all of this works. Well, I think I can probably I don't do Windows. So F5. Well, there is a clicker, and if I can figure out how to use that. There we go. How about that? So, first and foremost, why talk about media portrayal of disability? At the risk of blinding anybody off the top of my head, I'll take my hat off. So, thinking about movies and books and so on, how many times have they led a movement? Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. I guess I should have done that. That would be way more better. Yay. All right. And it even has a cheater slide, so I can see what the next one is, because I tend to I would say I create these slideshows. I started creating it, and then another person creates it because I get lost and thinking all over the place because I'm kind of an array thinker. So I also tend to talk over my slides, so forgive me, I'll get back to him. So movies and books and all sorts of stuff have sometimes led a movement for change. They're catalysts for change. And then I'm also kind of wanting to think about the times when movies and books have cemented or distorted some change or some idea. And a lot of this happens through various media, news, movies, and really make a difference. And I'll have a couple of examples in a moment that have absolutely nothing to do with disability. And think about media, movies, news stories, that so many of them fall kind of somewhere in between. There's some good and there's some bad. And some of that was talked about in media portrayals in the last workshop, where they talked about characters in movies. Was it a good portrayal? Was it a bad portrayal? Well, those are really broad things. Was it effective? Was it ineffective? Was it real? Was it fanciful? Well, some of them are fiction, and fanciful is the name of the game. But what aspect of it maybe crossed the line and perpetuated some image, kept change from happening? And what of them maybe boosted change? Many, many examples. Well, media sometimes leads the way. And whether it's television, whether it's movies, whether it's a news story, sometimes it can have a huge impact. And I see a man taking a picture, and it's just reminded me, if I don't record some of this, I have a staff member who's going to be very unhappy with me. So bear with me one moment. I have to remember how to do that. I think I can do that this way. There we go. Example of when social change was driven and really preceded by a television show. And let's see if anybody recognizes this. Anything interesting about that photo? Anything shocking about that photo? Not nowadays, right? I mean, it's really not. We see actually very recently start to see, as a matter of course, interracial couples and so on in advertising and in movies more so, but in advertising especially, just kind of a natural course of things. This was absolutely incredibly groundbreaking at the time. This had never been done, and it was exceptionally controversial. And I would suggest that it led a movement for change. It was ahead of its time, but it was forecasting the time, as so many things Star Trek did, at the time. I mean, here's our communicators. And I just want mine to turn into a phaser. That'd be fun. Set on stun, depending where I was at. Anyway, so Star Trek led the way. And this is a good example of the power of television, the power of media to be able to do that. What about times when media has held something back? Anybody think of an idea that really significantly, a significant social issue, something that's been slowed down because of perception? We might say some things related to the whole intersectionality, that there's been various things over time that have cemented or seem to cement stereotypes. But perhaps one of the most notable, and particularly for places like Colorado and Washington State, what about Reefer Madness? How much impact has this one stupid flick had on a nation in terms of its view on marijuana? Reefer Madness is still looked at in some groups. And let's face it, we've got some groups that aren't really all that with it in this country. I would hazard a guess that maybe they're not at the leading edge of what academics are talking about. But that whole attitude, that whole notion of Reefer Madness, that idea that this gateway drug will lead to horrible societal trends, still impacts our public policy, right? Powerful stuff. And so as we start to look at things in the media, particularly if we're kind of activist in nature, then we have to really take it seriously and think, what are we perpetuating and what are we leading a change on? Yes? Star Trek was, that was about 1967, I think, somewhere around that time, mid-60s. Yeah, mid-60s. It was incredible. Star Trek did some cool stuff. So Reefer Madness was 1936, and it's still having an impact, I suspect. So I really wanted to stress the portrayal of disability in the media is a serious issue, as evidenced by this Callahan cartoon with the wheelchair in the desert and the posse. Don't worry, he won't get far on foot. There is a movie about Callahan, John Callahan, out Oregon native and cartoonist. Anyway, I just kind of threw that in because, words and attitudes and ideas. And sometimes we have to lighten up in our groups. Think of words you might see or hear in the news. And I really want you to think about it because I'm going to ask that question. So what do the words used say about disability? Are they positive, negative, or neutral? So what kind of things might we expect to see in the media? What word would you see to describe a person with a disability in a news story? Acacia? Inspirational. Person is inspirational. What's another word that you might see? A story about a person with a disability. Inspiring. Another word? Suffers from could be a phrase you'd see in a news story, right? Wheelchair bound. Oh yeah, wheelchair bound. That's been around a long time. Others? What other? Courageous? Brave. They're brave. Oh, they're horribly brave, yeah. And extraordinary. They've overcome, right? Yes? Yeah. It's amazing, truly amazing. Superhuman. Anything else? I mean, there's a bunch, right? So how many of the words that you might see, what about special? You ever see special? What about retarded? What about brain damaged? What about afflicted? Confined? Okay. There's a lot. How many words do we see in the media that we would really intrinsically say are positive words? Very many?
I think a lot of them are euphemised, so it's on the surface level positive, but...
So a positive word on the surface, but euphemized, the way it's used ends up being limited. Because courageous and brave, those are great words in and of themselves, right? We'd see something as somebody, to me, they're nuts, but if they climb a mountain, climb a mountainside, that's pretty courageous, that's pretty brave. But if they do it, if they're blind, that's really courageous and really brave, right? Or if they do it, they have somebody pack them up there because they use a wheelchair and then they wheel over parts, that's inspiring. So there's all these words in the media. And so these are things we kind of look at and we think about because, as has been suggested, a word in and of itself is just a word. It's how it's used and how it's applied. And interestingly, in the world of disability, there's a lot of discussion about words. So we've really stressed this notion of person first. I'm a person with a disability. I'm a person who experience limited blah, blah, blah. And this has kind of been the litany that we've, and me included, that we've carried on in the disability community. And some of that narrative is actually starting to change. I still remember when I first started out, and I didn't do a very good job about talking any of my history, so here's a little blurb. I've been executive director of Disability Action Center for a long time, and I worked there since about 1983, off and on. And I came to it because I've, probably bought a Cadillac for a psychiatrist or two in my lifetime, maybe a day, I don't know. Prices are high. But anyway, so one of the first things I taught, because we sink our teeth into this, when you're an activist, I realized that the disability rights movement was a social movement. It's a human rights movement. It's exciting. And so I started looking at this stuff very seriously. I said, people first stuff. And I remember a Daily News article way back in the day, and it said, wheelchair-bound woman hooked on water skiing. I thought, oh my God, that's got to be illegal in some states. Because they bound her up in a wheelchair, and somehow they've got her on a hook, and they're dragging her. I mean, this is horrible stuff. So I wrote a letter to the editor, and I said the glasses-bound staff at the computer screen. And I don't know that they had computer screens at the time. Maybe they just did. But anyway, so I took it really seriously. And I used to chastise people a lot. Well, kind of interestingly now, a lot of this has changed because some groups of people with disabilities don't like this person-first stuff. Autistic adults, there's a whole movement. I'm not a person with autism, I'm an autistic adult. I'm an autistic person. And so people are starting to take some ownership of the condition, and that kind of takes a lot of the power out of it, right? And so it's kind of cool. And you see the same thing, of course, with the LGBTQ and lots of other things that I'm not even going to try to throw in there because I get myself confused. But you see this sense of we want the identity. This is part of our identity. By God, we're proud of it. And so is that showing up in the media? So that's a major question. So we talked about this one, and it's one of my favorites. Some terms just keep on rolling along. They keep on rolling along. Wheelchair bound, confined to a wheelchair. Is it a country western song or is it illegal imprisonment? I don't know. I think it could be put to a good, Dan, you could end up putting it to a good guitar riff. I'm wheelchair bound. I'm wheelchair bound. Anyway, heading out to wheelchair. No, not going to happen. Never mind. Anyway, I mean, it is silly language, but it's still used. KXLY News uses it a bunch. So here's the local news, July 24th in 2017 from Nadine Woodward, I believe it was, up in the KXLY. A freak accident altered the lives of a North Idaho family forever, and now that family is seeking help paying for mounting medical debt. What a shame we have to do that in this country. Jesse Raymond was spending a June day on the water when he dove into the Snake River and hit his head on a rock, leaving him wheelchair bound. And so that shouldn't be around anymore. It really shouldn't. Because again, it connotes that somehow that person is left limited by that wheelchair. In fact, as we always tell folks, that person was freed by that wheelchair, by that piece of technology. What binds us up is that there aren't any damn curb cuts. And there's too many stairs, and Cella's rebuilds their stairs, but they don't put in a ramp. So those are the things that we wish would go away. And Creme News actually does much better, to be honest. It's kind of interesting as you start looking at them. So we had a lot of history in the news. So here's some of that real painful past. This goes back, way back to the Second World War, before the Second World War, in Germany. This person suffering from hereditary defects costs the community 60,000 Reichsmark during his lifetime. Fellow Germans, that is your money too. And there's the image of obviously somebody in a chair who appears to be feeble-minded. So that's disability in the media. Eugenics as a public health stance is still debated. Dr. Ada E. Schweitzer commented, "You cannot make a silk purse out of a sow's ear, neither can we make a citizen out of an idiot or any person who is not well born." And to prove that, they had beautiful baby contests, where in the Illinois State Fair, for example, you could win a $100 prize if you had the most perfect baby. Please, nobody with an illness or congenital defect allowed. Those are real things in the media. Here's something a little newer that maybe we all, if we're activists in nature, ought to be doing something about. Has anybody seen ads for a Spokane hyperbaric chamber? Let me see if I can get this to play. Will this actually, will this launch into a YouTube? Let me see. Oops. There we go.
These are my wheels. After traumatic brain injury in 2004, I couldn't get around on my own. My body moved slower, my brain moved slower, and my hands shook. Then my parents took me to the Spokane Hyperbaric Center, and after each treatment, I became stronger. Now, I play basketball, and I can do math problems. I'm even learning to play guitar. The Spokane Hyperbaric Center. Call them today. It'll change your life.
Now I've got to figure out how to get back there. Uh-oh. My God, what have I done? Sorry, I will skip ahead here. So, what do you think? Great ad, huh? I mean, it's a great story. I mean, it's a great thing that people can get. And I've heard, I had a board president for years and years who had some staph infections, and he ended up in the hyperbaric, and it was really helpful. These are great medical things. But what an image. We have a picture of a wheelchair, an old wheelchair. It's not a sporty wheelchair. It's not a nice wheelchair. It's kind of a broken down medical looking wheelchair out in the middle of some woods. Obviously, it's been discarded. So What image does that send to all of the Spokane viewing audience? Is it a positive image about disability? Are we doing anything about it? I just had a discussion with a staff member this morning, and I believe we were going to be doing a workshop up in Post Falls, and this will be the subject of it, where we're kind of inviting people. Is this something that maybe we should be a little bit more activist about? Should somebody be contacting the Spokane Hyperbaric Chamber? Should there be a group maybe writing some letters and saying, we don't like this portrayal? This isn't an image. We think, we love what you do. We need your services, but can we maybe have a little bit more honest portrayal of people thinking about those for whom your hyperbaric services will not discard that wheelchair? So, it's just a thought. So I need some technical assistance because this apparently is locked in on the last one. Bless you. So I've got this here, but I wonder if there we go. Okay, you're back. Okay, awesome, thank you. So yeah, I'll be able to trigger this one. So the next issue I wanted to talk about, now that we've seen some advertising and how they do, is how does the news report stories? And not just in general, because I think sometimes it's a sticky wicket, exactly what you do. I saw ESPN had an E60 program yesterday on that Saskatchewan hockey team that I believe a number of them were killed in an accident, and one of them is now using a wheelchair. And so it was a story, you know, and it had the kind of the usual stuff in there. It was, you know, I mean, it's tough. Nobody can take away that that's a difficult thing. And they actually then got through, this guy's learning to play sled hockey, and because he loves hockey. And so it's great. And so it was kind of a cool story. Sometimes we see things in sports, and they're picked up by media that are not quite so good. Here's an example.
After the game, the players For these kids, it doesn't matter who scored the touchdown. Both teams celebrated the victory. During a high school scrimmage in Georgia on the final play of the game, watch Seth McGee, who has Down syndrome, score an amazing 65-yard touchdown. Then everyone goes wild. After the game, the players congratulated him in person.
Good job, man. Good job, buddy. Good job, bro. Good job, buddy. Thank you. What a wonderful. Thank you. You got some wheels on, you know that?
Now that's what you call school spirit. For InsideEdition.com, I'm Lee Shups. For InsideEdition.com, I'm Lee Shups.
Thank you. See, my Christmas gift list is getting longer. So, what do you think? We see a lot of those, right? Somebody comes in, they allow them to score a touchdown, they bring in the team manager for the last minute of the basketball game, and they get to shoot a basket. How do y'all feel about that? Patronized? But they talk to the parents, and the parents are in tears, and they, oh my God, it was the most wonderful. And they talk to the person, oh my God, it was a great experience, I loved it. Being patronized is not always uncomfortable. Yeah, that's actually one of my board members. That's one of his. Every time one of these is on, he sends me the link. And I wish we could do something about it. But it's hard. We get into that whole discussion of special, right? How many people have heard about Special Olympics? How many people saw the outcry at the reduction of funding in the budget over Special Olympics? Did anybody feel like that wasn't quite their most important issue? That's a hard one, isn't it? Because that's a really, really popular national thing, but it stresses special. Everybody gets a ribbon. And so when everybody gets a ribbon, what happens in real life? Does everybody get a job? Does everybody make minimum wage at least? So there's a whole thing, a whole narrative that starts to happen, and that kind of ties into all of my work at Disability Action Center, that activist side. There's that narrative that happens that limits us as people. So while it may seem like an inspirational thing, it may seem like it's a great thing for that person, and it likely is, the overall damage, the overall harm may be much, much greater than that benefit is worth. At least to us. It may not be to that person's family, and that's what makes these things so awfully difficult. We actually ran the transportation program in the city of Moscow, which was not much of a transportation program when you consider that Pullman's transportation, public transit, is in the millions, and Moscow's was around 100,000 at that time. And so actually Pullman's transportation system is roughly the same as Boise, a city in an area of far, far greater size, of course. So anyway, we had the transportation program, and I had a board member. They felt like, wouldn't it be great if we could have a van for at least Friday nights, maybe some of the kids, they called them kids because they were their kids, we could go to a movie. And I said, you know, it'd be really great if everybody had an opportunity. We should try to see if we can get some funding so we can have a van operate, but we don't want to have it just for one group. And she was really offended. I think at that point I became her public enemy number one, because I would limit the access of her youngster because I was concerned about the image of special and that this was a dedicated service for those people. And anytime I think you can apply the term those people, I think we have a problem. Because we've seen that when we apply the term those people to groups all over. I had an American Indian friend that he used to always talk about people being well-meaning for those people, he said. And of course, that's our example when we talk about disability in the media. We have other groups who've shared many of the same types of stereotypes, right? And so that's part of what we battle. So these are things we wish we would not see, and I don't know how to deal with that. And I'm not sure how to deal with Special Olympics and special things like that. It's true that people need to have, and they ought to have, we ought to provide for folks an opportunity to interact with others. That we shouldn't just have vocational workshops as being the only place where people with a significant developmental disability can get together at sub-minimum wage. We ought to be doing that, but we ought to call it what it is. If it's athletic competition, then I really think most folks can handle winners and losers. It goes with the territory. It's kind of what athletic competition is all about. So I wish, in a sense, that these news stories could show that sort of thing. And that's an interesting thing to think about. Again, we can't cover it all, and there are so many of these. And I say there's basketball, there's football, there's all sorts of things. And of course, it crosses over. Of course, we have women who also, women playing men's sports. Oh my God, what a great news story. But we do that, right? So, because news by its very nature is biased. It's biased to sell a product. And that's what we have to most remember. So, anyway, that's kind of an interesting aside. Uh-oh, now it's kicking over this one. It's not kicking over this one. Help. My controller starts to control one screen but not the other, so I... All right, I think so. I think we're... All right, there we go. So, what about movies and TV shows? We actually talked about this in the past, the last presentation. Acacia talked about these things. But what about movies and the portrayal? And I won't spend much time on this because we already kind of talked about it. But it is important to remember. Isn't it an angry villain? Is it the old wheelchair user, the old guy who was always really crotchety and he wants to knock off somebody? Ray Milland in the old movies and various folks. Or a pitiful character. God bless us, everyone. What are they saying? What about the, oh my God, I'd rather die than have a disability? Now me, I just want a sporty chair. I don't want that one that's sitting out in the woods that the hyperbaric chamber shows. So movies like $1 Million Baby. Everybody see $1 Million Baby? What happens with $1 Million Baby at the end? She can't take it, right? She can't live with a disability, and so suicide. And so we see that a lot. Me Before You, that was a movie I think that came up in the other workshop, if I'm not mistaken. Where again, you know, you don't want to be a burden. But this is repeated. We've seen it for years and years in movies. And sometimes, let's be honest, sometimes maybe that's a choice somebody makes, but it's the matter of how we portray it that really has an impact. So there's some fairly good examples about, and I say fairly good, because none of them are perfect. Forrest Gump, that was one that was interesting. But what about Forrest? I mean, Forrest did a lot of things, obviously very improbable. But what characteristic did Forrest maintain throughout the time? Kind of a positivity. He was positive. What innocence. He was really innocent, right? Because people like that maintain their innocence. They don't know when their best friend's father is abusing them. They do something, but we don't know about that stuff. But we can have sex and make a baby. So there's some things in there that there's some kind of holes in the system. But overall, what about Lieutenant Dan? Lieutenant Dan? Lieutenant Dan actually is kind of an interesting portrayal because when you really think about what people do really go through, I mean, in a sense, we kind of cringe in a way, but in reality, I've known a lot of folks that have acquired a disability and they really do go through stages of grief. They really do go through those hopeless times. And everybody's different. Of course, that's the other thing that sometimes the movies don't let us know, right? That every one of us is different. So Lieutenant Dan does pretty good. He ultimately gets some really, really expensive prosthetic legs thanks to Bubba Gum Shrimp. But all in all, not a bad portrayal. There's another one we talked about, interestingly, because an old guy like me remembers way back with Raymond Burr. He used to be Perry Mason, and then after he was Perry Mason, Raymond Burr ended up in a wheelchair because he was shot and hit in the spine as a police officer, and so he ended up, I'm sure at the time, confined to a wheelchair or wheelchair bound. And wherever he was bound to, he arrived in a wheelchair. And the neat thing about it actually is it was actually a fairly positive portrayal. And interestingly, it was remade recently with Blair Underwood. So it got away from the white straight male non-disabled person in a wheelchair, and it came on with an African-American non-disabled male in a wheelchair. But it's still an interesting portrayal because even back at the time, I mean, Ironsides, that was kind of a whole thing about the name and the Ironsides and, you know, obviously because of the wheelchair and the steel, you know. But in actual fact, every episode was about this cop that was really good. And he was a good cop. And sometimes he'd run into stuff where the wheelchair was a real hassle. I mean, he got, you know, couldn't get someplace or he got stuck or knocked out of his chair. But in reality, it was just a part of the show. And so for something that actually aired in the late 60s, early 70s, it did pretty good. And again, it was remade. I'm not sure, anybody familiar with the new Ironside? I'm not sure whether it ever hit the airwaves or whether it's a Netflix thing or whatever, but it's out there. And again, it was really lambasted by the disability community because it doesn't include people with a disability. When there are a lot of chair users out there potentially who would have happily taken the role. I Am Sam. Everybody remember that with Sean Penn? Anybody seen that? I Am Sam is a story about a mentally disabled man, Sean Penn, has an intellectual disability, and he and another young woman have a child. The child is non-disabled, but the mom leaves, and Sean Penn ends up raising, along with some other friends that show up for various pizza and movie nights and so on and so forth, until a school system decides or other professionals decide they're going to take the child away because this person can't be a parent. And then ultimately they decide that his parenting has been very effective, and so she's returned to the household. So in a sense, it was really kind of it was an uplifting movie. It still has that childlike innocence and, you know, some stereotypical stuff, but there's a great example of the power that things like this, that maybe some of us in the business would kind of, it's not perfect. We'd wish it'd be a little bit better, but still, I'll tell you a story about I Am Sam. The state of Idaho, does anybody think of the state of Idaho as a leader in all things? Does anybody think about a social leader in anything? Well, I have a story for you. Idaho was one of the first states in the Union to pass a law that protected the rights of parents with a disability. Parents with any disability, so that any child custody dispute in the courts over divorce, any childbirth issue, anything related to children and custody of children had to determine the quality of parenting, not the presence or lack of a disability. And that doesn't happen in very many states. It was a landmark passage. We had to play with it a little bit. Initially, they didn't want to include people with a mental illness. And so it was 2 years later that we got that included. But anybody that's familiar with processes of state government, and it's the same whether you're in Idaho or whether you're in Washington, is a bill will get written, hopefully, if you can find a sponsor. Then hopefully you can find co-sponsors. Hopefully you can get co-sponsors from both sides of the aisle and maybe even throw in an independent if you can. So the more co-sponsors you have, the better it looks. But ultimately, anytime you have that bill, you have to pick, or sometimes it's picked for you, a committee that bill goes to. So what's it most going to impact? Well, in this case, a change in child custody laws and disability stuff went to the Health and Welfare Committee in Idaho. Now, everybody, we live in a democracy, right? Group makes a decision. Wrong. One person can drive legislation. The chairperson of a committee can choose to have a bill looked at, or he can she can open their drawer and shove it in there, and it's gone. It will not get debated on the floor. It will not see the light of day for that session unless you can find another committee that can take it up and override it. Well, in this case, this bill came to the Health and Welfare Committee. And debate was raging. Oh my God, what if a person in a wheelchair, what if somebody runs away and they're going downstairs and the person can't follow him? What if a person's blind and they don't know what their child's doing? What if? Oh my God, our world's full of what ifs. The sky is falling. Gee, we never hear that, do we? Certainly not. These days, nobody would foment fear. Anyway, sorry, I lapse into things now and again, don't I? It's terrible. Shame on me. So everybody was talking about this. Well, it just so happened that the chair of that committee had gone and seen I Am Sam. And he told the other chair, the people in the committee, he said, I want you to come see a movie with me. And they went out, and a number of them showed up, and they went to see I Am Sam. The next day, they unanimously passed that legislation. And it went to the floor. It passed. It was one of the leading things. You'll see stuff about Idaho quoted in there's an outfit called Through the Looking Glass on parenting with a disability, and Idaho was one of their leaders in that. And I'm really proud of that. A good friend of mine who's director of the National Council on Independent Living now, Kelly Buckland, a chair user who has a son who's now flying. We were leaders in that, and that was really cool. And so that's the power that media can have. So even when it's not quite perfect, it can still shape something. And so as we look at things and we kind of become overly critical, we kind of have to be aware also that, wait, is there another message there? And I bring that full circle back around to my terminology thing because I've really softened on terminology now. And I encourage other folks around me, because take a look at what's happening before you chastise somebody on the language they use, because it may be that they're your best friend. And so let's see if we can tweak things rather than lambaste somebody with stuff. So we had this Durrett talked about too earlier. Glee, the character in Glee. Most folks are not played by disabled actors. Imagine that. And so what is often some kind of a positive portrayal for the most part, other than the dancing scene, dreaming of not being in a chair, which again, there's always those times, every one of us, I dream I could throw a football like Joe Montana or something, but never happened. And I've not yet been able to dunk a basketball. So things are changing. This is the kind of the pleasurable trends. We're starting to see some cool stuff. Here's a 19-year-old deaf Asian transgender actor, Chelaman, and he will play the mute bisexual hero, Jericho, in the DC Universe series, Titans. So that's kind of cool. At least they're using it now. You can say things about the superheroes and the powers and all that stuff, but regardless, they're using an actor with a disability. Anybody watch Game of Thrones? I hear it's the last season of Game of Thrones, right? And this is Tyrion Lannister, played by Peter Dinklage, who's been in 4,000 movies as the dwarf, because that's what they have, right? Little people. We go way back to the Wizard of Oz, and all of the we are the Lollipop Guild and so on and so forth, and so they got midgets for that. And little people that did not have dwarfism. And so they actually got jobs, but it was definitely a stereotypical portrayal. This is kind of a cool one, because even though the storyline talks about, the discrimination and so on he faced even with his own family, the character itself is a powerful character, right? And it doesn't really focus, the character does not focus on his dwarfism or his small stature. Focuses on lots of other stuff, and it's I've never watched it, so I've just, as I was looking at things, it kind of piques my curiosity, but I've been told that one shouldn't watch just one, so you end up binge watching. The average American sees about 5,000 advertisements in the media per day. And of course, when you start throwing in things on the phone and so on, there's a tremendous amount of advertising out there. People with disabilities make up about and their family members, and so on, 25% of Americans. So do we see 1/4 of the people in ads persons with a disability? No. However, we are starting to see more, and I think that's the positive side. One thing that's kind of interesting, we have a program called Blue Path, and if you look at it, blue-path.org, it's a website that looks at things based on the Americans with Disabilities Act, looks at accessibility of businesses, and you'll see that most Pullman businesses are actually on there thanks to Washington State University students and some community activity things that they did. That looks at creating a listing for people with a disability and their friends and their family members of places and what kind of access they have. So you know when you're going out to a restaurant, is there a bathroom I can use? Is the lighting good enough that I can read a menu? Do they have large print menus? Are they really noisy with lots of echoes? Is it hard to hear? And things like that. So we hope it's going to be really helpful for people with a disability. The flip side of that is it markets businesses. And a lot of businesses, they look at us and say, well, market. Well, no, it's, because how do we look at disability issues? Is it business or is it charity? Charity, most often, right? Don't we think about disability and things like that as charitable kind of things? How many billions of dollars do you think the disability market is worth per year? Anybody a guess? How about millions of dollars? How about $220 billion a year? Which is about twice the teen market. So what we also tell businesses is, yeah, this is a charitable thing to do. I guess you could say that. It's giving people some information they really need. It's the TripAdvisor and so on, we hope eventually, of travel and visiting stores and programs for people with a disability. It's that information that nobody else has and so on. But by putting your businesses on here, you're going to market to over $200 billion in market per year. So it's powerful stuff. We have a negotiating point. Should we start to decide to use it with the media and with the general public? 1/4 of us, let's get together. Because we feel like normalizing how people with disability are just part of the community. We're part of the human condition. Because humans, by their nature, are different. And so we should just be a part of that humanity. Representation is important. We see a lot of that value of that positive image that's starting to work. We see same-sex couples with adoption. Oh my God, they all have kids. Now we see it everywhere. It's interesting, that local narrative where we start to see these things change and become so accepted. And you see many, many examples. We're starting to see examples of people with a disability just appearing in an ad. So we see advertising where there's a person signing as one of the families. Some of them you see, we actually did a thing signing, but it was with zombies, and so the fingers fall off. But anyway. Ads are an effective agent of change. So you have to do it right. If a brand calls out, hey, look at me, I'm using a person with a disability, and that's the central focus, it really doesn't work very well. If it's embedded, if it's a part of things, that works. So forget admiration, inspiration, pity. Remember, people with disabilities are not all super gimps. We're not likely to climb Mount Everest. So, the trends, pleasurable trends. I'll wrap up with pleasurable trends. Some companies are really focusing on people with a disability. And they're starting to pay attention to things that we need with technology. It used to be that Windows-based products were kind of the only ones that would be very accessible to people who were blind or visually impaired. You'd have to get external programs like JAWS and other screen reader programs. Apple came out with their new operating system, and they started to embed things like VoiceOver, the large magnification and so on. And they're carrying that a step further. Here's an ad.
People think that having a disability is a barrier. But that's not the way I see it. You can catch up with friends.
Ready?
You can capture a moment with your family. One face, small face, focus lock. And you can start the day bright and early. You can take a trip to somewhere new. You can concentrate on every word of a story.
A bird began to sing. Jack opened his eyes.
You can take the long way home. Or edit a film like this one. When technology is designed for everyone, it lets anyone do what they love, including me. It lets anyone do what they love, including me.
So good job, Apple. Person using a head switch to alter a movie and all the pictures. And one of the things I didn't do is because the one thing we don't have is an auditorially described. Some things are still not there.
Привет, Apple.
Thank you. So that's obviously focused advertising and trying to, sell more product because they've heard about that $200 billion market. Smart people at Apple. So the nicest, though, is as we see something that's just embedded in a part of things that isn't even mentioned. And so for the final view,
show me how you've been working out.
Pet 10 porcupines, then tackle the homework my teacher assigns.
Oh, that was a beautiful job. Action. 1, 5, start. Dad!
Homework.
Now give it a shot.
No homework.
High 5. You made that.
You were last on my list. I simply can't see why you even exist.
yeah, way awesome, eh? They don't even mention. The woman uses a power chair, and it's just about making snacks on honey graham wafers. Great job. And so that's the stuff, we start to see that, then that's just a part of life. And really, isn't that a little bit more reflective of what we see around us most of the time? I think it is, because that's kind of what we kind of feel like more and more at the local level. So that's my quick thing on disability in the media. Kind of covered all sorts of things as it kind of needed to, because I wasn't exactly sure what else would be covered. But as I really do encourage everybody to take a look as you see images and so on that are coming from somebody, as you hear language that you think might be a little limiting and it seems like the right thing to do, we should get together and continue to make our voices heard, because that's limiting somebody. And when the special thing comes up, try to figure out a way to see if that special can become kind of not so special, or maybe just everybody is kind of part of something. And to their credit, Special Olympics has begun, and there will be some a chapter starting here, I believe, on Washington State, or in Pullman. They actually have a program now that tries to pair kind of a 50-50 split of non-disabled and young people with a disability. So that's kind of a step. I mean, it's still artificial, but in reality, you know, it's part of it is giving an opportunity for folks to get involved, and it is an effort to try to balance things. And the reality is sometimes, you know, folks, we do hang around with who we feel comfortable with. And so having that opportunity to make the choice is what it really needs to be all about. Thank you. Any questions?